My name is Lars Boy Mortensen, and I'm one of the two chairs of humanities in DS, and the other one, Anne-Marie, happens to be present as well. I'm the head of the Center for Medieval Literature, and that's also where our speaker comes from, Dale Kedwards, who's a postdoc with us, and is an Old Norse scholar, but not, as you might think, researching the sagas, but actually medieval ideas of geography. So he has written his PhD on some Icelandic maps, and you are turning that into a book now, I know, and you have a wider project about the perception of geography in Northern Europe in the 13th century. And I know you were enough to guess that you're going to convince us that we are still medieval in some sense, or maybe not. But please.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you. So, the modern world map has, through the advent of aerial photography and satellite imaging, perfected our view of the world and of our place within it. The map is a graphic representation of territory expressed in the objective mathematical language of paired coordinates, latitude and longitude, to convey an image of a world that is neutral and universally agreed upon. If we doubt that the map is perfect in its relation to geographic reality, we can switch to satellite view. The map is lifted to reveal the territory that lies beneath it, and with which it aligns perfectly. This confirms that the map presents the world as it is. The Earth's surface is fully documented. There are no more dragons on the map's edges, no lands unknown, no terra incognita. Where earlier maps represented the best that could be done with primitive instruments, our maps today represent the long accumulation of increasingly accurate geographical data. The world map as we know it today is universal and inarguable. The foregoing paragraph was a hoax, a summary of some of the more pervasive misconceptions about maps that afflict the history of cartography and popular conceptions of it. My fundamental claim in this lecture is that maps tell us something about the culture that produced them. I will explore this claim primarily in relation to medieval mappings, but the larger question requires engagement with maps also from later periods. When we open Google Maps on our computers and mobile devices, we see ourselves at the centre of the world. Google's blue dot centres the world on our views and experiences, and if our explorations of a map take us somewhere we do not need to go, the centre map button refocuses the map on ourselves. However, Google Maps looks different depending on where you access it. It's notorious for attempting to stay out of geographical disputes and issues that relate to national identity. For example, users in Russia see a solid boundary line around Russia and Crimea, whereas outside of Russia, Crimea is surrounded by dashed lines indicating it is an occupied territory. In May 2016, India drafted a law, which since appears to have been rescinded, that would see those who published, quote, wrong or false geographical information about its disputed borders with Pakistan and China, a fine of up to 1 billion rupees, or almost 100 million Danish kroner. Outside India, Google Maps marks the borders with a dark grey dotted lines that indicate disputed borders, while inside India they appear as solid lines. The Gott-Peters projection, which was conceived in the 19th century but came to prominence in the 1970s, is a rectangular map projection that maps all areas that, so that they have the correct sizes in relation to one another. It notably corrects the illusion implied by other map projections, such as the Mercator projection, that Greenland is approximately the same size as Africa. This map projection is promoted by UNESCO. It attempts to make the world map fairer by restoring equatorial nations to their proper proportions. There are hundreds of other map projections that attempt to be fairer in their global emphases, to replace the European world concept, fashioned in the 16th century period of European oceanic expansion, with one that is more global. But as those familiar with a more recognisable Mercator projection, it is testimony to the power of the world image that alternate projections appear distorted or even wrong to those not familiar with them. And this map confuses a lot of our preconceptions about what the world looks like. The mid-latitude regions in the northern hemisphere, which are so prominent on 16th century maps, are vastly diminished in size, whereas equatorial regions are vastly amplified. No attempt to depict the spherical Earth on a plane surface can do away with problems relating to distance fidelity, angular conformality, and distortions of form. To swear the circle does some violence to physical reality, we know this, and the challenges are both technical and social. We must, as map historians, dispense with the common notion that the history of cartography is the history of the documentation of the Earth's surface, the course of which is marked by an increasingly sophisticated, increasingly accurate accumulation of geographical data. Our modern maps are indeed mathematically sophisticated, but they are humanly created for human purposes. Perspective is rarely arbitrary and never free from consequence. Maps tell us something about the cultures that produced them as much as the territories they depict. However, it has been the frequent work of maps to convince us that the concept it conveys is universal and inarguable, usually at the very moments when it is the most contested. The map's design, its projection, and variable scale are fraught with consequences. As the map historian Brian Harley has shown, political, religious, and social power produce the context of cartography, and in all times, maps have emanated from or have been used to construct national fantasies. Maps have been used to extol the virtues of empire, their imperial users responsible for deliberate distortions of map content for political purposes. As Google Maps shows, maps have been known to flatter their viewers with a self-centered vision of the world. The Ditchley portrait, it is known, was painted by the Flemish artist Marcus Geerhards the Younger for Sir Henry Lee, the champion to Queen Elizabeth I between 1559 and 1590, and was probably painted to commemorate the Queen's visit to Lee's house at Ditchley near Oxford in 1592. The portrait shows Elizabeth painted standing on a map of England. Not unlike Google Maps, the world emanates from the viewer, here as sovereign, and it's notable that her feet are planted more specifically in Oxford, which would commemorate a visit she made to this great house. Jerry Broughton has advocated that we try and see in maps a history without progress. Not that techniques do not develop over time, but that maps are always humanly created for human purposes. This isn't an unsophisticated map, but it does away with a lot of the sophistication we think of as a factor of modernity. It's dispensed completely with above-ground topography to show the London tube networks. So all angles have been made either at 180 or 45 degrees. These bear no relation to one another in geographical terms, but what's useful about the map is that it allows us to perceive the order of tube stations, which are all evenly spaced. So it's simple, but not unsophisticated. Its makers have dispensed altogether with scale, consistency in distance and direction, but the relationship between points, that is the essential order of the tube stations, is maintained. It is what cartographers refer to as a topological map, a type of diagram that has been stripped of unnecessary detail so that only information relevant to its purpose survives. This map was drawn by a draftsman called Harry Beck in around 1931, and this version was published in 1933. So it unfortunately antedates the foundation of the Victoria line. But it's my duty as a Scandinavianist to tell you that the earliest name of the Victoria line was the Viking line, because it connected Victoria to London's King's Cross. On the 15th of September 2009, Transport for London went a step further in removing the River Thames from the map. The Thames, of course, has minimal relevance to the map, which otherwise ignores above-ground geography, so any sort of roads, national rail lines, bridges, or tower blocks, other things that could inhibit walking above the ground. But the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, took to Twitter, and the Thames was reinstated 2 days later. But compromises for the sake of accessibility and clarity are not an invention of the 20th century. This map is one in a unique series of maps and diagrams that illustrated the geographical and astronomical treatise known in English as the Book of Curiosities. The manuscript we see here is a copy probably made in Egypt in the late 12th or early 13th century of an anonymous work compiled between 1020 and 1050. We can see at a glance that the map is schematic rather than mimetic of physical geography, like the Northern Tube map. It bears conventional signs, red dots around its perimeter. Each bears an Arabic inscription, and we see that these roundels in the body of the map are also inscribed with Arabic inscriptions. It is a detailed schematic map of the coasts and islands of the Mediterranean. In the west, it marks the Straits of Gibraltar, with ports and anchorages signified by evenly spaced red dots at its perimeter. The map, like the London Tube map, does not tell us anything about the distance between ports and islands, but is informative about their order. It shows the ports of Al-Andalus and of the Franks in the west, and then focuses on the eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, is about a quarter from the map's west. No notices about the island interiors or any information about the size of the cities is provided. The information is strictly nautical. So here we have Sicily, which is represented much too far to the east, but it's because from the perspective of the map makers, this was a difficult anchorage in this period, because it was no longer under Ottoman possession. And this is Cyprus here. And each island is greatly emphasized, but the order is correct. But what of the Middle Ages? What did their world map show, and where did their viewers see themselves on its surface? Well, we tend to recognize that the preoccupations with which I opened this lecture are emphatically false. We have nevertheless tended to project these prejudices onto maps produced in earlier times. We assume that their maps are incomplete, that they are propositions about the nature of the world that cannot possibly extend to the entire globe. We assume they are inaccurate, that their perspective is faulty. We acknowledge that our maps are not entirely objective, neutral, or impersonal, but assume that medieval maps must be less so. I want to advocate Jerry Broughton's History Without Progress, to explore the idea of a self-centered world map from the Middle Ages to the present day. My intention is not to demonstrate that medieval maps presage those of modernity, or that the preoccupations and anxieties we detect in later cartography is in any way medieval. What I will show is that maps tell us as much about the culture that produces them as about the territories they depict. Maps are one of the most useful and yet imperfectly understood witnesses to how past societies understood their environments and the places within them. The maps we have seen so far put the cultures or even the individuals that produced them at their centres. The cartographic monuments of medieval Europe, however, are an exception to this phenomenon. Through the examples I will show you were produced in England and northern Germany, their gazes are fixed outside the European continent. What distinguishes the maps of medieval Europe is that they do not place Europe at their absolute centres. Rather, these maps are centred on lands that lie outside of Europe, but centred on key sites in Christian history. Medieval world maps impress upon their viewers the sense of the marginal natures of their homelands, and are centred with the historic Palestine, the region bounded by the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, which was extraordinarily important to the religious and cultural histories of medieval Europe. The majority of these maps drawn in Europe before the early decades of the 15th century take the entire world as their object, their makers motivated by the intellectual desire to know the world and their place within it. The intellectual work of maps is to make the world or an aspect of it understandable. They represent ancient and medieval theories about the shape and nature of the world and its position in the cosmos, its places and the peoples who inhabited them. In the Middle Ages, maps were not the everyday objects they are today. Far from ubiquitous, they would have been rare, even minority forms of expression, less common and for the purposes of travel, navigation, trade and exploration, less useful than written directions. Indeed, the maps that survive from the Middle Ages are not useful travel companions, and are uncongenial to many of our modern expectations about what a map, or at least a good map, should be. The maps I will talk about are of the type referred to by modern and sometimes medieval scholars as mappa mundi, a term comprised of the Latin words mappa, meaning cloth, and from which English takes our modern word map, and mundus, meaning world cloth. These maps, of which the English Psalter maps compiled in around 1250 are a prime example, certainly were not the only kind of map that was drawn in the medieval period. Histories of cartography frequently focus on the newer cartographic genres that proliferated in the 15th century, portolan charts and the maps in the Ptolemaic tradition. The first of these, the portolan charts, are navigational maps of coastlines based on compass directions and estimated distances that originated in Italy, compiled for practical purposes by pilots at sea. Scandinavian and English seafarers who sailed southern waters may have encountered such maps of Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines in the 13th century, but coastlines north of the British Isles would not become known to these southern cartographers, and then very badly, until the late 15th century. The second cartographic genre to appear in Western Europe in the 15th century is that associated with the rediscovery of Claudius Ptolemy's Geography, a cartographic treatise and gazetteer written in Alexandria in around 150 of the Common Era. The treatise was lost to Western Europeans, although copies circulated in the Greek and Byzantine world, until around 1406, when it was translated from Greek into Latin by the Italian humanist scholar Jacobus Anglius. The introduction of this treatise to the Latin West reacquainted medieval Europeans with a means to encode and transmit geographical data digitally in the mathematical language of paired coordinates. Ptolemy's geography enabled mapmakers to plot coordinates in latitude and longitude on a graticule, that's a grid of lines, latitude and longitude, and explained how to construct two projections for a map of the world using mathematical principles. In the decades that followed its translation, the geography was revised and expanded with new maps, called tabulae modernae, modern tables, of regions poorly known to ancient geographers. The first modern map to show Iceland and Greenland was compiled by a Danish cartographer called Claudius Clavus in the late 1420s or early 1430s. In moments of cartographic quiet, descriptions of map artifacts in literary texts have been valuable sources for the presence of maps in a culture, especially in antiquity and the Middle Ages, where so few examples survive. The earliest known allusion to a map in the ancient world is the ekphrastic description of the design that adorns Achilles' shield in Homer's Iliad. This shield bears a representation of the world and all its the spheres that make up the physical universe. The earliest allusion to a map in medieval Europe takes literary form in Jonas of Bobbio's Life of St. Columbanus, written in northern Italy in around 643. In the life, the Irish missionary Columbanus intends to travel to Slavic lands to preach Christianity, but changes his mind when an angel shows him how distant these territories lay on the world map. The mention of this map, which may have been akin to small TO maps that circulated with the writings of Isidore of Seville, antedates the earliest extant example of such a map by around 150 years. The literary evidence for the use of maps at sea also antedates our earliest extant portolan charts by around 20 years. This appears in the French chronicler Guillaume de Longuey's Life of the Royal French Saint Louis IX in around 1300. In an episode that relates Louis's troubles aboard a ship bound for Tunis in around 1270, a storm forces the ship to change course, and its captain shows the king a mappa mundi, which in the circumstances must have been a portolan chart. In earlier cartographic scholarship, the Middle Ages have sometimes been seen as an interregnum between the sophisticated, mathematically informed cartographies of antiquity and of early modernity. This is easily shown to be a misconception. The three continents are an invention of the Ionian Greeks, and the Earth's sphericity was known to Plato. However, medieval mapmakers invested their maps with new significance produced by religious and political contexts of the 12th and 13th centuries. Maps are children of their times, and singular witnesses to the preoccupations and anxieties of their makers. It is no surprise that cultures have over time perceived physical terrestrial space in different ways, and these preoccupations have informed the maps they have made. None of us is naive enough to think that modern maps are objective or neutral, but it is proved all too tempting to back-project these standards onto earlier maps, to want to study them as evidence for the gradual documentation of the Earth's surface in a kind of self-congratulatory narrative that culminates in the modern world image. The world these maps depict is considerably larger than the area known firsthand to medieval Europeans. The known world comprised 3 continents, from Latin terra continens, continuous land, centred on the Mediterranean Sea, at the middle, as medius, of lands, terrae. This tricontinental land area encompassed all human history and civilization, and was in Latin called the orbis terrarum, the circle of lands. These maps are called tripartite or TO maps because they depict the circular O of the known world, divided into the 3 continents by the rivers Tanais and Nile and the Mediterranean Sea, whose intersection forms a watery T, here coloured in red. These maps were oriented very often in the traditional sense of the word, with east, from Latin oriens at the top. The circular form is conventional, a representation of the horizon that turns 360 degrees from the perspective of the viewer. Mathematical proofs of the sphericity of the Earth have been around since antiquity, and medieval people were aware that they inhabited a globe. In his Phaedo, Plato, in the 4th century BC, described the Earth from above as a patchwork of terrains and vegetations, stitched together like a leather ball. The English mystic Julian of Norwich, who lived until around 1416, wrote that she was shown the Earth in a vision. She held it as round as a ball and about the size of a hazelnut, she says, in the palm of her hand. The world known to medieval Europeans was known to be a small part of the world's surface, as we see in Cicero's hugely influential De Republica. The dialogue on Roman politics concluded with the dream of the Roman military tribune Scipio Aemilianus, in which he is visited by his deceased grandfather, a renowned general called Scipio Africanus, and taken up into the sky. From, quote, a high place full of stars shining and splendid, Scipio observes the cosmos and its stellar workings. Already in the 1st century BC, the Milky Way appeared to him as a circle of the brightest white. The stars were orbs far exceeding the Earth in size, and the moon shone with light borrowed from the sun. Scipio despairs at the smallness of the Earth, and even more so that of the Roman Empire, exclaiming that, quote, the Earth itself appeared to me so small that it grieved me to think of our empire, with which we cover but a point, as it were, of its surface. Scipio's cosmic vision became a cornerstone for cosmographical thought in the High Middle Ages through Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio, written in the early 5th century. Macrobius explained Cicero's literary allusions to the shape and nature of the cosmos, employing a series of maps and diagrams to show the spherical Earth in relation to the celestial sphere, the concavity of the night sky on which we see the stars move around the Earth, and delineate the globe into climatic zones based on latitude. The TO map does not represent a flat disk world, but rather the inhabited part of the northern hemisphere. Its circular form no more implies that the world is a flat disk than our rectilinear maps imply the world is a flat rectangle. The intellectual work of maps is to make the world or an aspect of it understandable. The map represents ancient and medieval theories about the Earth's shape and nature and humanity's place within it. In one sense, these maps are more complete than our own. They do not leave spaces unknown, but for love of speculation, story, and knowledge, populate the entire Earth's surface with texts and images. The map teems with history, mythology, and the sum of human knowledge. There was, in medieval Europe, a tradition of monumental maps, commissioned for display in public spaces where they would be seen by large audiences. We see one such example here. This is the 13th century Ebsdorf map, which was displayed in a convent in northern Germany. It measures 3 meters square and is painted on 30 goat skins stitched together and contained more than 2,300 texts and images. It was the largest map to survive to modern times from the Middle Ages, but it was destroyed in an Allied raid on Hanover in 1943. The largest example of a map like this that we do still have and that has survived to present is the English Hereford map that is produced in around 1300, which is now on display in the city's cathedral, where it has been for at least the past 400 years. The 700-year-old Hereford map was drawn onto a single piece of vellum measuring 1.6 by 1.3 centimetres, 1.3 metres rather. And you can see that it's the whole skin of a cow. So we can see its neck up here, its arms here, and the parchment is very bad, it's very folded there, it's very thick. So the quality of painting can only be so detailed. And under the microscope you can see all sorts of vascular structures within the parchment that have survived and remind us that we're kind of looking at a beast. With its 1,091 inscriptions, the map was an attempt to summarise human knowledge in fields as diverse as geography, ethnography, zoology and history. The locations of things on a medieval map have more to do with mythology, theology and history than with geographical reality. These maps draw the preponderance of their information from ancient authoritative texts, canonised for the High Middle Ages by late antique scholars such as Ambrosius and Isidore of Seville. The map is more, however, than simply a graphic representation of the Earth's surface. Rather, it is a visualization of history. When viewers stood before the map, they would have been able to read or hear explained to them the history of the entire world. At the top of the map, we have At the top of the map, we have the eastern extreme of the world. Remember, this map is oriented in the etymological sense of the word with east at the top. And we see a walled, battlemented enclosure here. It's surrounded by a red flaming ring. We can see some crenellations, and we can see some details inside. This is the Garden of Eden, the paradise that is on earth but inaccessible to humanity. Inside its walls we can see 2 figures. Eve holds out her hand to take the fruit of the tree of knowledge from a demon-headed serpent who hangs in the branches of a tree. And to the left of it we can see another scene from Genesis. We have an angel here brandishing a flaming sword, chasing out Adam and Eve from the Garden of Paradise. Within the garden we can also see the 4 rivers that, according to biblical authority, flowed out of the garden. When we approach the map's centre, we come forward a step in history. No. Yeah. We come forward, and I've not got a stop on this, so we kind of have to see it between movements. But I want to talk about this huge structure here, which is about to whiz up the map. Yeah. and that's the largest structure on the map. Halfway down between Paradise and the map's centre, we see the largest structure on the map. In Genesis, the story of the Tower of Babel tells us how, in their arrogance, people sought to build a city with a tower so high that it would reach the sky. But God punished this overreaching pride and humbled those who built it, causing humanity to speak in different languages. The biblical passage is, "So the Lord scattered them around from thence upon all the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth." The Tower of Babel is an origin myth that explains the proliferation of nations and languages so vividly and confusingly depicted on the map. If the map is confusing and if its contents are a mess, it's because of the events that happened between the creation of mankind in Eden and the events that took place in Babylon. When we come down this axis along the map further still, we come to the map's centre, and we arrive at the focal point of human history. That this roundel here has a compass hole that went through the map to fix it to the board on which it was displayed in its cathedral. And you can imagine a pin being put there while the mapmaker got a string and drew the circle around its centre. So it's a dead centre of a map, and it represents the city of Jerusalem. And with biblical authority, Jerusalem was situated at the centre of nations. According to medieval travelogues like Mandeville's Travels, an immensely popular and largely fictional account of one man's travels around the medieval world, Christ chose Palestine and Jerusalem as the site for his incarnation because it was at the middle of the earth, and from there his renown and humanity's redemption could reach all four corners of the earth. The region depicted at the map's centre was where Jesus was born and ministered, and where he achieved humanity's salvation through his death on the cross. The Crusades renewed interest in these regions depicted at the map's centre, as papal entreaties to recapture the Holy Lands, to reach Jerusalem and liberate it from Muslim rule, made the map's centre a site of acute fascination and yearning. As Daniel Burkholz has shown, maps of the 13th century can be seen in their Crusader contexts as visual support for Christendom's geopolitical aspirations further east. The greater part of the world depicted on these maps was subject to Muslim rule, and the map must have been a compelling call for its conversion. In looking back to the Incarnation, the map also looks forward to the Last Judgment, at which the Christian faithful would be gloried and the sinful punished. This is depicted at the map's apex, where Christ sits in judgment of the souls he has created. On the left, an angel guides the faithful to heaven. It says, "Arise, you shall come to joy everlasting." On the right, an angel guides the sinful to hell. It says, "Arise, you are going to fire established in hell." These inscribed texts relate to the devotional uses to which the map might have been put by a community of faithful viewers. A further inscription written in Anglo-Norman, the elite language of the maps and its patrons, addresses the map's communities of owners, listeners, readers and viewers to pray for the soul of its patron, the clergyman Richard de Bello. It says, "Let all those who have this history, or who shall hear, or read, or see it, pray to Jesus in his divinity to have pity on Richard of Haldingham and Lafford, who has made it and planned it, to whom joy in heaven may be granted." See, in all these inscriptions we have "Arise," Arise, Pray, we have instructions to the map's community of readers to take notice of the map's contents. It is perhaps less interested in telling the viewer where he or she is than in reminding them how little time they have left there. Around the map's perimeter are 4 handles, large golden letters that spell out mors, the Latin for death. The map reminds the viewer that their time on Earth is limited, but that rewards and punishments for good or bad deeds are eternal. The map is a teeming representation of the inhabited world, focused on the spiritual needs of a motionless mind. At around 157 centimetres high, the map is an unwieldy travel companion, but in its context of display at the Cathedral in the Welsh Marches of England, it enabled students and parishioners to explore themes in biblical history and exegesis, ethnography and zoology. Here we see regions in the vicinity of the biblical Tower of Babel, around which there are numerous settlements mentioned in the Old and New Testaments. So this is basically a visualization of biblical narrative. On the map we can see this pathway here, a course through the map, from Egypt through to Canaan. This is the route that the Israelites took in the book of Exodus towards the Promised Land. If you follow the meanderings of this route, you'll see where the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. Here, they get lost in the desert, and then finally find their way to the borders of Canaan and the Holy Lands. Here, we see a Red Sea, the Red Sea, and we see their passage through it. This is when Moses opens up the waters, he separates the waters so they can escape Egyptian pursuers. Here, we can see 2 towns that have been placed in the water. And these are the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were destroyed in the Bible. And we have a figure here who's looking back at them. An inscription tells us that this is Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt. The biblical story is that God is going to punish these 2 cities for their lustfulness and their sinfulness, so he casts them into water, he destroys them in a great conflagration, but warns Lot to take his wife and not to look back. She ignores this, she ignores the angel who tells him not to look back, and she's punished by being transformed into a pillar of salt. Here we can see various animals that inhabit warmer climates than those known directly to medieval Europeans. Again, I'm struggling for focus, but there's a large oblong structure just south of this in the map's depiction of Egypt, from which the Israelites are fleeing, which is labelled the Barn of Joseph. And these barns of Joseph was a medieval interpretation for the Egyptian pyramids, which were said to have been storehouses built by the biblical Joseph to store grain, which would be quite a charming medieval fact had it not been repeated on November the 4th, 2015 by the Republican presidential hopeful Ben Carson. So this is a really complex context of display, and this kind of reading is exactly what the map was produced for. It was designed to be shown and to be lectured in front of, and it's had an almost unbroken continuation of use in that context at the Hereford Cathedral. What I've tried to demonstrate in this talk is that maps are socially constructed forms of knowledge. Ultimately, a world map is an imaginative act, an illusion in which we can see the entirety of the Earth's surface at a glance. The map is of little use to those who travel, the world map that is. Indeed, this is not how we use world maps in our own time, but for the love of speculation about the world's vastness and our small place within it. Google Maps centres the world on our own visions and experiences, and if our explorations of a map take us somewhere we did not mean to go, the Centre Map button refocuses the map on ourselves. Likewise, the audiences of the Hereford map have, in its long centuries of public display, sought to locate their own global and temporal positions. A 3D scan of the Hereford map shows that the ink lies thick on its surface. We can feel the contours of a map's letters with our fingers if we touch it. However, the scan has also revealed that the text for Hereford, the place where the map is held and displayed, has been completely flattened, so that they hardly show up on a 3D scan, although traces of ink and pigment are still visible. The inscription that shows the location of Hereford has, in some point, been rubbed away and rewritten, probably as a result of generations of humans marking their place in the world with their fingers. These cartographic moments are centuries apart, separated by around 700 years. The users of Google Maps and of the Hereford map have used the representational technologies at their disposal to locate themselves in a global context. The existential proposition at the heart of a map is "you are here." And as both maps demonstrate, their users have responded, "here I am." This tendency for a map's viewer to use maps to think about themselves endows the maps with unique significance as sources for how past societies conceived of their physical world and their place within it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for taking us through, historically, through time and space. Floor is open for questions. Torben?
Thank you for a most interesting talk. I was wondering about, as you say these are imaginative feats and so on and so forth, I was wondering about who allowed those. Think about who allowed to create maps. The reason I ask is an example quite a bit later in the William Strata Smith.
Fantastic.
And because he was from a lowly background, canal digger as it were, I think his creation of the first geological map, actually the father of geology, he was not, seen as one who was worthy of creating such a map. So, do you have any observations on that going back to medieval times?
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, William Smith was a British geologist who pioneered the mapping of geological strata and produced the first thematic map of geology in England and Scotland. England, part of Scotland, I think. And he did so in 1815, which was before the establishment of the Royal Geographical Society, and before the point at which really map making gets taken up by centralised government and state. He is an exceptional pioneer of that kind of mapping. William Smith certainly had technical and draftsman skills that allowed him to do so.
My question was using William Smith as an example of those who are, shall we say, worthy enough to create these maps.
I see.
So relating to, shall we call it, institutional constraints, sanctions, and so on and so forth, or norms relating to who are not. Is that something you've looked into?
No, it's not. It's a fascinating question, though. Thank you for it. Thank you.
I liked your example of the London Tube map. I grew up in London, in the west of London, and until I was about 14 or 15, I just took it as a literal representation of where things were. And when I was in my sort of mid-teens there, my father took me up to London and drove me around, and I was quite amazed to find that a lot of places it took 3 tube trains to get to were actually within very easy walking distance.
Yeah.
And the other thing I remember from my childhood is, and I think this relates to the sort of political aspect of maps, was when I was about 7, I should think. I remember in the schoolroom there was a map almost the size of that projection there, where the British Empire was coloured in a sort of deep pink colour. And it was something that we sort of were instructed in.
Yeah.
This is in around about the late 40s we're talking about.
Mapping has had a central role in the construction of imperial ideologies, and the maps of 19th century Britain centred, I mean, the international meridian, the habit of centering the map on around Greenwich was universally agreed upon, or internationally agreed upon, in 1884. And before then, all different nations tended to put themselves at the centre. But yeah, its point is absolutely to show that the sun can never set on the British Empire, because it has territorial possessions around the full Earth, and it was characteristically shaded pink. And we think of the role cartography played in the scramble for Africa, and the violent partitioning of territories there, and pink was the British colour, and also Spain and Portugal were big former oceanic powers who had all these colonies. And sure, the two map is a really fantastic example as a topological map. But there are lots of websites that tell you tricks you can play on people by getting them to take tubes that actually don't take them any great distance at all. And there are great keys that tell you which routes are quicker to walk, and there are many. Yeah.
Please.
Thanks for a very nice presentation. Just a reflection, I suppose, and then a question. Just a reflection of the fascinating map they're going through here seems to be more in sort of globalization theories. There's this idea often that our narrative that we're becoming more and more global, that we are increasingly imagining the world as a whole. But we're clearly on this map seeing an imagination of the world as a whole. So it kind of disrupts the narrative of an increasingly progressive understanding of globalization. So that was just a reflection that I thought was fascinating. Then maybe, and the question that relates to the fact that this map versus the Google map you showed us in the beginning is not only a spatial representation, but of course also a temporal representation, in the sense that there is a history from the narratives of the Bible inscribed on the map.
Yeah.
Could you reflect upon how the contemporary maps that are seemingly only spatial, they are attempting to, or have an ideal of objective geographical representation? To what extent do we see temporality inscribed on those maps?
Yeah, thank you.
I think that was just an interesting thought.
I know that those are both excellent points. On the global concept matter, yeah, it's true that there's a kind of visualization of a global context here, but it's also important to notice, of course, that this representation would have meant absolutely nothing to people who lived there. It's not a representation of the territory from the interest of its populations, but of the interests of the particular elites who produced it.
Mm-hmm.
And in this context, it was the community of parishioners at an English cathedral town who weren't interested in a lot of detail, but were very interested in kind of, this strange creature here and kind of the marvels of the East. And the second point, about whether or not maps inscribe temporality in other contexts. I mean, and they absolutely do, don't they? Because if we use Google Maps, we're not, when we measure distances on it, we rarely talk about miles or kilometres, we think about 20 minutes. And of course the agreement of having a zero meridian focused on Greenwich was to do with time as well as space, and it's still the time zones that we use. And we see how those are so imperfectly enacted on a map, when we see a map of time zones as well. So I think that the concerns have always been twinned. I mean, certainly on the Hereford map, it's a statement of human history and the harmony of space and time. And likewise, I suppose, the modern map is about harmonising different global perspectives as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a nice talk as well. My name is Charlotte. I'm from the Department of Marketing and Management. I wondered, have you looked into contemporary maps in children's books? Because they might resemble this kind of map. And I mean, these years there's a lot of discussion about what to call people from Africa, and a lot of children's books that are contested because of the worldview they expressed 30 years ago. And it might be interesting to look into. There's a lot of nice books with maps, world maps with animals and people and stuff from different regions. It might be interesting to see different historical views of the world. And also if there was difference between that kind of maps produced for children in Africa and children in Europe.
Yeah.
I wondered if you looked into these things.
Yeah. The kind of map you're describing is instantly recognizable, because we grew up with that kind of thematic map that awkwardly combines ethnography and zoology and presents it as a children's kind of tool for instruction. These maps are similar in the sense that they do combine these elements, but it might be a little awkward to think of medieval or pre-modern maps as, or indeed maps in any sort of non-literate societies as like children's cartography, because they are sophisticated and they do what they need to, but they're not trying to simplify for a kind of childish perspective.
But I mean, it's grown up who produce the maps.
Yeah.
It might say a lot about how we view the world.
Yeah. It has a lot. It has a lot to do with the sort of mental disconnect that happens between how adults see the world and how we see it, to communicate that view to children. Thank you.
So you had, on the one slide, you had a remark that said the fact that the TO map was a circle didn't mean that people thought the world was flat. And that reminded me of an earlier talk where one of your colleagues, I think, talked about the medieval conception, debunked the myth of the Earth was flat. And you cited some textual evidence now for that. You said in some writing, some people said it was Scipio report and so on. Now, is there anything, as a map expert, is there anything in the graphical display that you could use to make the same argument? I'm just out of curiosity, or do you have to use textual evidence or statues, sculptures, and so on to make that point?
We have graphic evidence. The myth of a flat Earth is largely a product of earlier map historians looking at the TO map and assuming it's a flat disk world. We do have graphic representations of the spherical Earth. We have different cartographic genres that circulated with Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio that attempted to show how the Earth was basically spherical, how its climate varied with latitude even, so that the further north you go in the northern hemisphere, the cooler it gets, and the further south you go, the hotter it gets. And we had this distinction of the globe into two hemispheres. So from as early as antiquity, we have hypotheses about what was on the underside of the Earth, the southern hemisphere, and we have maps and texts that show like a projected Terra Australis, which became Australia, or Terra Incognita, but lands in the habitable belt in the southern hemisphere. We do have graphic representations.
Maybe if you can just have an add-on question, because I was thinking even before you had perspective in drawings, right?
Yeah.
Would that be indistinguishable if I draw like a circle, or I try to draw a sphere? Wouldn't that be apart?
Oh yeah, I mean, they're always circular, but they have textual inscriptions that tell you what things are. So they always have the equator and the circle, the middle. It's fairly explicit about what their meaning is.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dale again.
Thank you.